The Christmas tree in town square stood tall for all to look in awe. The varying reds and blues and yellows and greens coiled around the towering tree like a colorful snake. Children tightly clutched the hands of their mothers and fathers and grinned with crooked teeth at the masterful display of the holidays. Its light cast into the empty buildings and lonely streets emptied by men and women standing around this spectacle. In the wake of the cheerful holiday, smiles came another surprise. Snow began to fall from the sky, dressing the streets with growing blanket of sparkling white, heavier than a flurry, yet not quite a storm. Children stuck their tongues out with flushed cheeks, giggling, and myriad of snowflakes melted on them. And for that moment in the bitter cold, it seemed as though the world revolved only around that tree that stood tall right in front of them. But there was, of course, one and only family that were in the small town who had decidedly rejected the invitation to be around all the others. At last, the woman was much more content, sitting idly in her chair and waiting for their information regarding her husband. She had told her child that he had been out working for the last few days, trying her best to cover up the fact that he had, in fact, gone missing. Now, for 4 days gone, and by nothing yet to show it all, she could stare intently at the static on the television and neglect the wilting Christmas tree. The woman barely grasped its half-empty bottle of vodka in her hand, and when she peered the pitter-patter of soft feet, she instinctively placed it in the shadows behind her. Her gaze fell upon a small boy that sprinted into the living room, waving a tiny turquoise blanket back and forth. "Mommy!" His shrill voice cut off as the buzz that she had acquired from the alcohol. She winced. "There's a man with a badge at the door, and he said he wants to talk to you." Her daze was immediately broken and sat upright on her chair, staring at him with furious rage in her eyes. "You opened the door?" she scolded. The boy stared back at her for a moment before looking down, only to be met with a back of the hand across the face. He stepped back, grabbing his reddening face with tears, brimming with eyes as she stood up, exhaling sharply. "I told you to tell me first when someone knocks." She sighed with exasperation, stumbling out of the living room and hugging the wall for balance as she moved to the front of the door to open a crack. Deep in the background, she could hear the Frosty the Snowman playing in the boy's bedroom. She shooed her child away, opening up the door enough for her face to be seen. A police officer stood in the snow, fingers in the loops of his belt, as he greeted her with a grin. She met with his grin with a deep frown. "What are you doing here so late?" Her voice was slurred, causing the officer's expression to waver. "Your husband." His voice was deep and out of exasperation. "We've learned a bit more where he might be." Her expression almost immediately changed. She stepped back, opening the door fully. The officer stepped in, ranking his feet across the welcome carpet, as the first of the black cold burst into the warm home. She closed the door quickly, shuddering from the bitter weather. Further down the lonely streets, there was movement in the shadows beside the buildings and the broken lamp posts. A figure walked through the darkness as if it was their home. The hood on the head, the fervor and the veiling of the person's face from the view of the naked eye. The being walked slowly, as if savoring the bitter cold that surrounded them as the pitch-black boots left prints in the thin blanket of snow. The figure began to speak with the voice of a delicate man. It was a whisper, with the softness of an exhaling lullaby. However, there was a clear malevolence within his undertone. The soft noise snug at the slow pace. "It's the most wonderful time of the year." Nobody was around to hear the man's chanting voice. However, he seemed to enjoy the solitude surrounding him. Under his arm, he cradled a large cardboard box, wrapped horizontally with a variety of different papers. A substance scribbled at the bottom of the corner of the box and onto the snow, though the hue was unseen in the darkness. With the kids jingle belling and everyone telling you, be of good cheer. The shadowed man suddenly was subjected to the dim of the spectrum of the barely functioning streetlight. Pitch black eyes sparkled against the brightness of his pale and shrunken face was shown. However, the visual was only granted for a brief moment. As he continued his troll, a droplet of the crimson red sunk into the blanket of the white as he passed through the streetlight. He looked forward towards the police cruiser parked in front of the home that had been traversing through the snow to find. A small grin formed in his features. His soft feet cracked against the snowy sidewalk with a purpose as he tried his best to stay within the darkness. Inching closer to the home, he eventually stood at the front of the dreary, yet moderately lit up building, at to the point where he walked the free concrete stairs, continuously singing to himself. It's the most wonderful time of the year. He placed down the box on the doorstep, adjusting to the large ribbon that had been placed on it. He stood up and grinned, growing from ear to ear as the light washed over his face. A large and jagged scar ran down just beside his eye and all the way down to his lower jawline. He lifted his clenched up fist, rapping it down on the door a few times. He waited for a moment before turning around, quickly slinking back into the shadows before the door was open. The woman had taken her place back in the reclining chair. The officer stood awkwardly as he explained the current situation to her, purposefully ignoring the stench of alcohol in her breath and darting his gaze away from her half-closed eyes. She pushed her bottle of vodka back behind the chair as she listened intently as she could to the man. She nodded slowly. So you found his car? The officer solemnly nodded, granting her with another faint smile. Yes, on the outskirts of town, hidden in the trees. He looked away from her and glanced at the Christmas tree that had shed much of its pine needles due to the malnourishment. We don't know why it's there or where he ran off to, but it's a start. They have a canine unit sniffing the abnormal scent right now. The wife took the solace in that knowledge. Her husband possibly being okay was better than uncertainty she had been facing. As if on cue, the little boy ran into the living room once again, particularly jumping from the balls of his feet. I heard a knock, Mommy. She then sat up with a sigh. I didn't open this door this time, Mommy, I promise. She pushed back at him, walking down the hallway with the police officer behind her. She opened the door, only a crack at first, to see if anyone was actually there. She saw no person, but a large gift was placed on their doorstep. With a raised eyebrow and opened the door, glancing at the various different wrapping papers used to wrap the gifts around the outside box. The people eyed the present closely before the expression changed. Great concern was washed over him as he stepped in front of her with a nervous chuckle. Let me open it first. Probably just some pranksters again. He stepped outside and took out his box cutter, getting onto his knees as he drew in a breath. This wasn't the fault of any teenage pranksters. He had been, in fact, the force long enough to know what exactly this was. With great caution, he took the ribbon off and tossed it aside, pressing the blade onto the wrapping paper and through the top of the box. He ran the knife across until he was able to open up the top with ease. As he opened it, he drew back quickly, covering his mouth as he fought the urge to vomit. The present had been worse than he imagined it to be. Curiously, the wife took a look inside. Her expression distorted into a shock when she let out a blood-curdling scream that echoed across the darkened sky. She hugged the wall as the little boy ran up to the noise. Mommy, what's wrong? But she didn't respond, simply falling to her knees as she sobbed into her hands. The boy placed a small hand onto her shoulder. Mommy? The child moved to take a glance at the contents of the presents. However, the officer stood up quickly and covered the boy's eyes, drawing him back to where he stared at the box in terror. Inside the box was a severed head, submerged into the chin with a pool of its own blood. The man's hair had been matted with substance, and his eyes were wide, almost alive with terror. His mouth hung open, and his face was riddled with cuts and bruises. A scar ran from just the right of his eye, all the way down across his cheek to his lower jawline. At the top of his head, there was a Santa hat tainted with droplets of blood. The officer pushed the child back to its mother, who held on to her with a confused expression on his face. The officer barely stood on its hind legs, gripped a piece of the wrapping paper, and staring at it. It seemed that the legends were, in fact, true. He stared at the sticker that had been stuck to the wrapping paper, a still image of Santa waving on his mitten with the person looking. To the fortunate family, from Citrus Nightshade. I'm here.